The text message arrived at 2:47 in the morning. By dawn, a man was dead. By the following week, his wife, a respected businesswoman, had been arrested. What investigators discovered in the days between those two moments would expose a web of deception so carefully constructed, so coldly maintained, that even seasoned detectives struggled to believe it. On the morning of September 10th, 2010, in the quiet residential suburb of Birstall, West Yorkshire, England, a scene unfolded that would haunt the officers who attended it for the rest of their careers. Stuart Gledhill, a 43-year-old telecommunications engineer, was found dead inside his own home. He had not been robbed. There were no signs of forced entry. The house was neat, suburban, entirely unremarkable. A 3-bedroom semi-detached on a street where nothing ever happened. Stuart had been beaten to death with extraordinary violence. West Yorkshire police were called to the address following a welfare check. Stuart had failed to appear for work, which his colleagues described as completely out of character. When officers entered the property, they found him in the living room. The severity of the attack, delivered by a blunt instrument, told investigators immediately that this was not a burglary gone wrong. Whoever had done this had come with intention. Whoever had done this had come with fury. The first question detectives asked themselves, the question they always ask first, was, who was the last person to see Stuart Gledhill alive? The answer came quickly, and it came from inside the marriage. His wife, Jennifer Gledhill, had been in the house that night, and she was already gone by the time the body was found. To the outside world, Stuart and Jennifer Gledhill presented as a functioning couple. They had been married for over a decade. They shared a home, shared finances, moved in the same social circles. Stuart was known to his colleagues as steady, dependable, mild-mannered. Jennifer, 44 years old at the time of her husband's death, worked as a finance director, a position of authority and trust that required meticulous attention to detail and the kind of composed, professional demeanor that impressed everyone around her. But marriages contain rooms that neighbors never see. Detectives from West Yorkshire Police's Major Crime Unit began the methodical process of reconstructing the final weeks of Stuart Gledhill's life. What they found, threaded through phone records, emails, financial transactions, and witness interviews, was a picture of a marriage that had quietly fractured. Stuart had reportedly become aware that something was wrong. Friends later recalled him seeming withdrawn in the weeks before his death, distracted, as though something were pressing down on him that he hadn't yet found the words to name. Jennifer, by contrast, appeared to those who knew her to be operating entirely normally. She went to work. She attended social commitments. She functioned, as she always had, with precision and control. What investigators were about to uncover was that Jennifer's composure was not the calm of innocence. It was the discipline of someone who had been planning something for a very long time. Within 48 hours of Stuart Gledhill's body being discovered, detectives had identified a name that would become central to the entire investigation. Gary Heaton. Heaton was a former police officer. That detail alone caused a particular kind of tension in the incident room. Not suspicion of the investigation, but an awareness of what it meant that a man with law enforcement training had been involved, however peripherally, in the orbit of this crime. Gary Heaton and Jennifer Gledhill had been conducting a secret affair for a significant period of time. The relationship had been conducted with care and deliberate concealment, the kind of concealment that suggests both parties understood exactly what they were hiding and why. Phone records obtained under warrant painted a detailed picture of their communication. In the days and hours leading up to Stuart's death, the volume and nature of the messages between Jennifer and Heaton was notable. Investigators analyzed the content, the timestamps, the gaps between replies, all of it forming a timeline that would become the scaffolding of the prosecution's case. Heaton was brought in for questioning. He cooperated with police. He confirmed the affair. He denied knowing anything about Stewart's murder, but cooperation is not the same as innocence. And denial, investigators knew, is sometimes the first performance in a much longer play. Reconstructing the events of September 9th and into the early hours of September 10th, 2010, became the central obsession of the investigation. Detectives needed to establish with precision where Jennifer Gledhill had been, what she had done, and crucially, when she had done it. Jennifer provided an account to police. She had been at the house that evening. There had been an argument with Stewart. She confirmed this. She then left. She said she had not returned. She said she had driven away and stayed elsewhere. This account became the foundation upon which detectives began building their case. Not because they believed it, but because every false account contains pressure points. And pressure points, with enough careful investigation, eventually give way. Forensic teams combed the Gledhill residence with extraordinary thoroughness. The nature of the attack meant there was significant physical evidence at the scene. Blood spatter analysis was conducted. The weapon, a blunt object consistent with a hammer or similar implement, was not immediately recovered. But the pattern of injuries told a detailed story about the direction, force, and repetition of the blows. This was not one strike. This was sustained. This was personal. CCTV footage from cameras in and around Birstall was pulled and reviewed. Investigators began a painstaking process of tracking Jennifer Gledhill's vehicle movements throughout the night. Every automated number plate recognition camera, every petrol station forecourt, every residential doorbell camera that might have captured a passing car was identified and interrogated. The footage told a different story than the one Jennifer had given police, significantly different. What the CCTV analysis revealed was movement inconsistent with Jennifer's stated account. Her vehicle had been recorded in the vicinity of the family home at a time when she claimed to have already departed and traveled elsewhere. This was not a minor discrepancy. This was the kind of gap that, in a murder investigation, transforms a person of interest into a suspect. Simultaneously, forensic scientists were working through the physical evidence recovered from the house and from Jennifer's vehicle, which had been seized for examination. The presence of biological material, analyzed through DNA profiling, would become one of the most significant pillars of the prosecution's case. Forensic science in England had, by 2010, reached a level of sophistication that made concealment of physical contact extremely difficult. What you touch leaves traces. What you do leaves marks. The weapon itself remained a critical unknown. A murder weapon tells its own story. Manufacturer, dimensions, grip patterns, purchase history. Detectives worked to trace what had been used to kill Stewart Gledhill, and in doing so, to trace where it had come from and where it had gone. Financial records were also drawn into the investigation. As a finance director, Jennifer Gledhill had access to significant funds and understood accounting systems deeply. Any unusual transactions, any evidence of preparation, of planning, would be examined under the microscope of prosecutorial scrutiny. In a case built on deception, investigators knew they had to look not just at what had happened, but at what had been arranged, sometimes weeks in advance. Jennifer Gledhill was arrested by West Yorkshire police on suspicion of murder. The arrest came after detectives had gathered sufficient material, CCTV evidence, forensic findings, phone record analysis, and witness accounts to justify taking her into custody. She was interviewed under caution. Jennifer maintained her account. She'd been at the house. There had been an argument. She had left. She had not returned. Police had been investigating serious crime long enough to recognize the particular quality of a prepared account. The absence of the small errors, hesitations, and contradictions that genuine recollection always contains. Jennifer Gledhill's account, by multiple officers' assessments, had the texture of something rehearsed. She was charged with the murder of her husband, Stewart Gledhill. Gary Heaton's role in the case was also examined closely. The question that investigators and later prosecutors had to grapple with was the question that defines conspiracy in criminal law. To what extent, if any, was Heaton involved in the planning or execution of Stewart's death? The evidence gathered would eventually lead to Heaton also being charged, not with the physical act, but with conspiracy to murder. 2 people, 1 victim, a secret that had been kept for months, until it couldn't be kept any longer. Among the most compelling strands of evidence assembled by prosecutors was the detailed analysis of the communications between Jennifer Gledhill and Gary Heaton. Digital forensics had advanced substantially by 2010, and investigators were able to recover deleted messages, reconstruct communication timelines, and build a picture of a relationship that had moved in the months before the murder from romantic secrecy to something considerably darker. The content and pattern of messages in the period immediately preceding Stewart's death revealed what prosecutors would describe as a couple navigating the logistics of removing an obstacle. Stewart Gledhill was that obstacle, a husband whose existence stood between Jennifer and the future she had apparently decided she wanted. What investigators found particularly significant was the nature of communication in the hours immediately following the murder. The messages sent and received by Jennifer Gledhill in the period after Stewart died, but before she had officially reported anything or been contacted by police, contained the kind of careful, controlled language that spoke not of shock or distress, but of management, of situation control. Heaton's messages in return were similarly measured. 2 people speaking in a register that suggested awareness, not surprise. Grief, investigators have long observed, looks different from performance. The difference, when you know what to look for, is unmistakable. The Crown Prosecution Service, working in close consultation with the West Yorkshire Major Crime Unit, spent considerable time constructing the case against Jennifer Gledhill and Gary Heaton. This was not a case with a single, overwhelming piece of evidence. There was no confession, no video recording of the act itself. Instead, it was a case built on accumulation. Dozens of individual strands of evidence, each one insufficient alone, but woven together forming a net that prosecutors believed was inescapable. Forensic evidence from the scene and from Jennifer's vehicle, CCTV footage establishing her presence near the house at the critical time, phone records documenting the communication pattern with Heaton, financial analysis revealing preparatory activity, witness testimony from colleagues, friends, and acquaintances of both Jennifer and Stewart, constructing a portrait of a marriage in crisis and a woman who had made her decision. The question of the murder weapon remained a point of significant investigative effort. Although the weapon was not definitively recovered and produced in court, the forensic evidence from Stewart's injuries, combined with materials analysis from the scene, allowed pathologists and forensic experts to characterize the instrument in detail. The force applied, the repeated nature of the blows, the specific pattern of injury, all of it consistent with a sustained and deliberate attack. Pathological evidence confirmed that Stewart Gledhill would have died relatively quickly, given the severity of the trauma inflicted. He would have had no realistic opportunity to defend himself once the attack began. This too spoke to preparation, to an ambush, not a spontaneous confrontation. The most chilling detail: investigators believed Stewart Gledhill may have trusted his attacker completely, may never have seen it coming at all. The trial of Jennifer Gledhill opened at Leeds Crown Court. It would become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in West Yorkshire in years. Not for its courtroom drama, though there was plenty, but for what it revealed about the capacity of ordinary people to construct extraordinary deceptions within the walls of ordinary lives. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically. They began with the scene, with Stewart Gledhill, his life, his work, his marriage, before turning to the night of his death and walking the jury through the evidence strand by strand. CCTV footage was shown, Phone records were displayed and analyzed. Forensic experts took the stand to explain their findings in terms accessible to a lay jury without sacrificing scientific precision. Jennifer Gledhill sat throughout the proceedings with the composure that those who knew her had come to expect. She presented as controlled, attentive, and composed, qualities that prosecutors were careful to acknowledge were not themselves evidence of guilt, but which stood in notable contrast to how someone facing a charge of murdering their husband might be expected to appear. The defense challenged the forensic evidence with vigor. They questioned the chain of custody for physical exhibits. They challenged interpretations of CCTV footage, arguing that the presence of Jennifer's vehicle in a particular location at a particular time did not in itself establish what had happened inside the house. They attacked the integrity of the phone record analysis, suggesting that the conclusions drawn by prosecutors exceeded what the evidence could legitimately support. These were proper and competent challenges. They did not, in the jury's ultimate assessment, succeed. What the jury saw, piece by careful piece, was a picture assembled with the patience of investigators who had known from the beginning that the truth was in the details. Among the witnesses called was a colleague of Stuart Gledhill's who testified about his demeanor in the weeks before his death, a man who had seemed troubled, who had made passing remarks suggesting domestic tension without ever detailing it. This testimony helped establish that the marriage had been under strain, lending context to what investigators believed had been Jennifer's growing sense that the relationship had become a problem to be solved. Friends of Jennifer were also called. Their testimony was careful, often visibly reluctant, the testimony of people who cared about someone they were simultaneously struggling to reconcile with what they were hearing in court. They spoke of Jennifer as competent, organized, occasionally intimidating in her efficiency. They described Gary Heaton. They described the sense, looking back, that they had missed something. The digital forensics expert who analyzed the communication records between Jennifer and Heaton proved to be among the most impactful witnesses of the trial. In measured, technical language, they walked the jury through a timeline of messages that prosecutors argued amounted to documented evidence of planning. Not planning the murder in explicit terms. There were no messages saying what was going to happen, but planning in the sense of logistics, of alibi construction, of the kind of sequential arrangement of facts that reads very differently in hindsight than it might have in real time. The defense cross-examined the digital expert at length, focusing on the limits of inference and the gap between what messages contain and what they prove. The expert held firm on the data. The interpretation they acknowledged was for the jury, and the jury interpreted carefully, deliberately, over many hours of deliberation. After the prosecution and defense had concluded their cases, after the judge had delivered a detailed and scrupulously fair summing up that ran over several hours, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They had been presented with an enormous volume of material over the course of the trial: forensic reports, communication transcripts, expert testimony, witness accounts, CCTV footage, financial documents. The deliberation was not swift. This was not a simple case, and the jury took seriously their obligation to examine the evidence with care before reaching a conclusion. They asked questions. They requested that portions of evidence be read back to them. They returned to the jury room and continued. Jennifer Gledhill remained composed throughout, including during the wait for the verdict, a wait that, for the family and friends of Stuart Gledhill gathered in the public gallery, was an agonizing extension of a loss they had already absorbed, but for which they had not yet received formal acknowledgement. Investigators from the West Yorkshire Major Crime Unit, the men and women who had worked the case from that first morning in Birstall through months of painstaking evidence gathering, who had traced phone records and CCTV footage and forensic samples through a chain that led link by link to this courtroom, waited alongside everyone else. After everything that had been uncovered, after every careful piece of the case had been laid before 12 ordinary citizens, the question had passed entirely out of the investigators' hands. The truth they believed they had found now needed to become a verdict. Jennifer Gledhill was found guilty of the murder of her husband, Stuart Gledhill. The verdict was delivered in Leeds Crown Court, guilty on the charge of murder. The word landed with the weight of everything that had preceded it. Every hour of investigation, every analyzed message, every frame of CCTV footage, every forensic sample processed and cross-referenced, every witness who had taken the stand and tried to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person the evidence described. Gary Heaton was also found guilty of conspiracy to murder. The jury determined that his involvement in the planning of Stuart Gledhill's death was established beyond reasonable doubt by the evidence presented. 2 people, 2 verdicts. One calculated act. In the public gallery, among those who had attended the trial throughout, the verdict produced the particular, compressed silence that comes when a verdict both expected and dreaded is finally delivered. When confirmation brings not relief exactly, but the end of uncertainty. Stuart Gledhill had been killed by his wife, aided by her lover. The investigation that had started on a quiet morning in Birstall had ended months later, with 2 words that settled every open question the case had carried. Guilty, guilty,